What would you do if you can discover the food you're raving about was from the ashes of your husband, which you labeled RIP, rest in peace? In a vibrant town surrounded by lush forests and sparkling rivers, there lived a woman named Emma. Emma had an unparalleled love for cooking and a knack for experimenting with different spices and herbs. She owned a charming mobile kitchenette, which she used to deliver delicious meals to the bustling office space park nearby. Her food was always a hit, and she took great pride in her culinary creations. One sunny morning, Emma received an unexpected job offer from Mrs. Thompson, a wealthy widow who lived in a grand mansion on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Thompson had heard about Emma's culinary talents and wanted her to be the cook for her household. Excited by the opportunity, Emma accepted the job and worked at Mrs. Thompson's estate. As Emma settled into her new role, she continued to experiment with different ingredients, always striving to create the perfect dish. One day, while organizing the pantry, she came across a small, ornate container labeled RIP Curious. She opened it and found a fine, grayish powder inside. Without thinking much of it, she decided to use a pinch of the mysterious powder in her next dish. To her amazement, the dish turned out to be an instant hit. Everyone who tasted it raved about the incredible flavor and couldn't get enough. Word spread quickly, and soon Emma's culinary creations were in high demand. Her business flourished, and she became the talk of the town. Mrs. Thompson, noticing the sudden surge in popularity, asked Emma to write a shopping list for the ingredients she used. As Emma listed the usual spices and herbs, Mrs. Thompson curiously inquired about the RIP spice that seemed to be the secret to Emma's success. Emma, puzzled by the question, explained that she had found the container in the pantry and had been using it in her dishes. Mrs. Thompson's face turned pale as she realized what Emma had been using. The container labeled RIP, which means rest in peace, contained the ashes of her late husband, which she had kept in the dining room cabinet as a memento. Horrified and heartbroken, Mrs. Thompson explained the situation to Emma, who was equally shocked and deeply apologetic. But there was a twist. Mrs. Thompson, despite her initial horror, began to see an opportunity. She noticed how the use of the ashes had brought immense popularity and wealth. Driven by greed, she decided to capitalize on this macabre secret. She opened restaurants in different cities, using the ashes in the dishes. Strangely, the ashes never seemed to run out. Unbeknownst to Emma, Mrs. Thompson had sacrificed her husband for riches. She had been told by a mysterious figure that as long as she found a cook to unknowingly use the ashes, her wealth would continue to grow. This was why she had employed Emma, knowing her culinary skills would make the dishes irresistible. Mrs. Thompson, whose full name was Margaret Thompson, had always been a woman of ambition and determination. From a young age, Margaret dreamed of a life filled with luxury and success, far removed from the humble beginnings she knew. Margaret met her husband. Harold was a kind and gentle man. Deeply in love with Margaret, they married and moved into a beautiful house on the outskirts of town. Despite their comfortable life, Margaret's ambition never waned. She wanted more than just comfort. She wanted wealth and recognition. Harold, supportive of his wife's dreams, invested in various business ventures to help her achieve her goals. However, many of these ventures failed, leaving them in financial strain. Desperate to turn their fortunes around, Margaret became increasingly obsessed with finding a way to secure their wealth. One day, Margaret encountered a mysterious figure who offered her a dark proposition: immense wealth in exchange for a great personal sacrifice. Blinded by her ambition, Margaret agreed, not fully understanding the gravity of the deal. The figure instructed her to sacrifice someone dear to her and use their ashes in her culinary creations. The ashes, he claimed, would bring her unparalleled success. Torn between her love for Harold and her insatiable greed, Margaret made the fateful decision to sacrifice her husband. She kept his ashes in an ornate container labeled RIP and hid it in the dining room cabinet. The guilt of her actions weighed heavily on her, but the promise of wealth kept her going. Margaret's restaurants flourished, and she became a wealthy and influential figure in the town. However, the price of her success was steep. She lived in constant fear of her secret being discovered and the consequences that would follow. Her relationship with Harold's memory became twisted, as she both mourned his loss and reveled in the riches his ashes brought her. When she hired Emma, Margaret saw an opportunity to continue her success without directly handling the ashes herself. She manipulated Emma into using the RIP spice, ensuring the dishes remained popular. Margaret's greed knew no bounds, and she expanded her empire, always keeping a close eye on Emma to ensure her compliance. Emma, unaware of the dark secret, continued to cook, bringing joy to many with her delicious meals. However, she always felt a strange unease whenever she used the RIP spice. One day, she decided to stop using it altogether, relying instead on her natural talent and love for cooking. The restaurants continued to thrive, but Mrs. Thompson's greed grew insatiable. She became more and more obsessed with her wealth, losing sight of everything else. Emma, on the other hand, remained true to her passion for cooking, creating dishes that were loved by all, even without the mysterious RIP spice, and Mrs. Thompson's restaurants flourished. However, the uneasy feeling never left Emma. She carried on, hoping for a way out of her predicament. One fateful day, a fire broke out in the kitchen. One of the chefs, distracted by a trending video on social media, accidentally left the gas on. When he lit his cigarette, the restaurant exploded. The fire consumed everything, including the RIP spice. When Mrs. Thompson received the phone call about the explosion, her reaction was a mix of shock, devastation, and panic. She had built her wealth and reputation on the success of her restaurants, all of which were now reduced to ashes. She had not only lost her restaurants, but also the RIP spice that had brought her so much wealth. Emma, though shaken, was finally free from the dark secret that had haunted her. The loss of the RIP spice was particularly crushing, as it had been the secret ingredient that fueled her prosperity. As the reality of the situation sank in, Mrs. Thompson's initial shock turned into a frantic desperation. She realized that without the RIP spice, she had no way to replicate the success of her dishes. Her mind raced, trying to think of any possible way to salvage her empire, but it was too late. The ashes, which had seemed endless, were now gone forever. In her grief and anger, Mrs. Thompson felt a deep sense of betrayal and loss. She had sacrificed so much for her wealth, including her own husband's ashes, and now it was all gone. After the devastating fire, Emma was left shaken, but relieved to be free from the dark secret that had haunted her. The explosion had destroyed the restaurant and the RIP spice, severing the sinister connection that had bound her to Mrs. Thompson's greed. In the aftermath, Emma took some time to recover from the trauma. She received support from friends and family, who were unaware of the true nature of the events that had transpired. Emma decided to move away from the town to start fresh, away from the painful memories. She relocated to a quaint town where she opened a small, cozy cafe. This time, she focused on using fresh, local ingredients and her own unique blend of spices and herbs. Her passion for cooking remained undiminished, and she poured her heart into every dish she created. Word of Emma's culinary talents quickly spread in the new village, and her cafe became a beloved spot for locals and visitors alike. People were drawn not only to the delicious food, but also to Emma's warm and welcoming personality. She found joy in seeing her customers' smiles and hearing their compliments. The realization that her greed had led to this disaster weighed heavily on her. She had manipulated and threatened Emma, only to lose everything in a single, tragic moment. Mrs. Thompson's reaction was not just about the loss of her restaurants and wealth, but also a profound reckoning with the choices she had made. She was left to face the consequences of her actions, alone and without the riches she had so desperately sought. The once powerful and wealthy widow was now a broken woman, haunted by the very greed that had driven her to such lengths. This tragic event marked the end of Mrs. Thompson's reign of greed and manipulation, while Emma, though scarred by the experience, found solace in knowing she could now cook freely, without fear or guilt. On the other hand, Emma's new life was filled with peace and fulfillment. She no longer felt the strange unease that had plagued her before. Instead, she embraced each day with gratitude, knowing she had overcome a dark chapter in her life. Her cafe thrived, and she built a new community of friends who appreciated her for who she truly was. Emma also found fulfillment in feeding street kids with the leftovers from her cafe. She became very close to one of the street kids named Matthew. Matthew's life on the streets was a harsh and challenging journey. After losing his parents in a tragic accident, he found himself alone and without a home. With no relatives to take him in, Matthew had to learn to survive on his own at a very young age. On the day was his birthday, and his parents had just bought him a little red toy car, which he always kept with him. He felt it watched over him. The streets were unforgiving, and Matthew faced many hardships. He often went without food and had to find shelter wherever he could. Despite these difficulties, he remained resilient and resourceful. He learned to navigate the city, finding safe spots to sleep and places where he could get a meal. Matthew's days were filled with uncertainty, but he never lost hope. He made friends with other street kids, and they looked out for each other, forming a makeshift family. They shared whatever little they had and supported one another through tough times. One of the places Matthew frequented was Emma's cafe. Emma's kindness and generosity stood out to him. She always had a warm smile and a kind word, and she never hesitated to share leftovers with the street kids. Over time, Matthew and Emma grew close. She saw the potential in him and admired his strength and determination. Emma's cafe became a safe haven for Matthew. It was a place where he felt valued and cared for. Emma encouraged him to dream big and believe in himself, offering him not just food but also hope and a sense of belonging. Despite the challenges of street life, Matthew's bond with Emma gave him the strength to keep going. Her support and encouragement made a significant difference in his life, helping him see a brighter future beyond the hardships he faced. One day, while cleaning her kitchen, Emma was shocked to find the same repeat spice container sitting on her table. She was bewildered as she thought it had been destroyed in the fire that had consumed Mrs. Thompson's restaurant. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma decided to investigate how the container had found its way back into her life. Emma picked up the phone and dialed Mrs. Thompson's number, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and curiosity. After a few rings, Mrs. Thompson answered. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Emma. I need to talk to you about something very important," Emma said. "What is it? You sound distressed." "I found the RIP spice container in my kitchen today. I thought it was destroyed in the fire. How is this possible?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Thompson's voice, when she finally spoke, was filled with a mix of shock and guilt. I I don't know how to explain this. I thought it was gone too," Mrs. Thompson said. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to know the truth. How did it end up here? Did you have anything to do with this?" Mrs. Thompson sighed deeply, her voice trembling. "Emma, I swear I didn't send it to you, but there's something you should know. The ashes, they were never meant to be used like that. I was desperate and made a terrible mistake. I thought I could control it, but clearly I was wrong." "What do you mean?" "What mistake?" "I made a deal, Emma. A dark, terrible deal. I sacrificed my husband for wealth and his ashes were supposed to bring me success. But I never imagined it would come back like this. I thought the fire had ended it all." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The weight of Mrs. Thompson's words sank in, and she realized the gravity of the situation. "Mrs. Thompson, this is beyond anything I could have imagined." "What do we do now?" Emma asked. "I don't know, Emma, I truly don't, but I think we need to find a way to put this to rest once and for all. Maybe there's a way to break the curse." Emma and Mrs. Thompson agreed to meet and discuss their next steps. Mrs. Thompson felt a deep sense of remorse and fear. She had lost everything in the fire, and now the dark secret she had tried to bury was resurfacing. She knew she had to face the consequences of her actions and find a way to make amends. Together, they embarked on a journey to uncover the origins of the curse and find a way to break it. Emma, driven by a desire to free herself from the haunting presence of the RIP spice, and Mrs. Thompson, seeking redemption for her past mistakes, worked together to find a solution. During their investigation, Emma and Mrs. Thompson uncovered several startling revelations about the origins and nature of the RIP spice. They discovered that the mysterious figure who had approached Mrs. Thompson was part of an ancient cult that thrived on human sacrifices in exchange for wealth and power. The ashes of the sacrificed were believed to hold magical properties that could bring immense success to those who used them. The ashes were not just a source of culinary magic, but were also cursed, and the ashes would never be fully consumed, perpetuating the cycle of greed and misfortune. This explained why the ashes seemed endless and why they had reappeared in Emma's kitchen. The news was terrifying to both of them. They learned that the curse also brought misfortune to those who used the ashes. While it initially brought wealth and success, it eventually led to ruin and despair. Mrs. Thompson's loss of her restaurants and the fire were manifestations of this curse. To break the curse, they needed to perform a ritual to properly lay the ashes to rest. This involved returning the ashes to a sacred place and performing a ceremony to honor the deceased and seek forgiveness for the sacrificial act. Emma's pure intentions and genuine love for cooking made her a key figure in breaking the curse. Her involvement was crucial because she had used the ashes unknowingly and without malice, which provided a unique opportunity to end the cycle. With this knowledge, Emma and Mrs. Thompson set out to perform the ritual. They traveled to a remote, sacred site. Emma and Mrs. Thompson discovered that the sacred site they needed for the ritual was an ancient grove deep within the forest, known as the Grove of Eternal Rest. This grove was a place of great spiritual significance, where the townspeople believed the spirits of the departed could find peace. The grove was surrounded by towering trees, their branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, ethereal glow. At the center of the grove was a stone altar, covered in moss and ancient carvings. It was here that they would perform the ritual to lay the ashes to rest and break the curse. With the guidance of an old wise woman from the village who knew the ancient rites, Emma and Mrs. Thompson prepared for the ceremony. They brought offerings of flowers, herbs, and water to honor the spirits and seek their forgiveness. As they performed the ritual, they felt a profound sense of peace and closure, knowing they were finally putting the past to rest. They honored Harold's memory, asked for his forgiveness, and vowed to never let greed overshadow their lives again. The ritual was successful and the curse was lifted. The ashes were finally laid to rest. Emma and Mrs. Thompson's journey to the Grove of Eternal Rest marked the beginning of a deep and transformative bond between them. After the ritual, Mrs. Thompson and Emma returned to the village, their bond stronger than ever. Mrs. Thompson, now free from the curse's grip, began to see life with new clarity. She took Emma under her wing, treating her like a daughter. They spent more time together, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. Emma, who had lost her own family, found comfort and a sense of belonging with Mrs. Thompson. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Mrs. Thompson opened up about a painful chapter from her past. She told Emma about the accident that had changed her life forever. It was their son's 5th birthday, and they were on their way to celebrate when their car skidded off the road. In the chaos, their son, Matthew, was thrown from the car. Despite their desperate search, they were told he had died, though his body was never found. Emma listened with empathy, her heart aching for Mrs. Thompson's loss. She couldn't help but think of the street kids she had befriended, especially Matthew, the boy with the kind eyes and resilient spirit. She remembered the little red toy car he always carried, a cherished possession he never parted with. Emma's heart raced as she realized the connection between Matthew and Mrs. Thompson's lost son. She could hardly contain her excitement and nervousness as she brought Matthew to Mrs. Thompson's house. The boy, with his kind eyes and resilient spirit, clutched his little red toy car, unaware of the life-changing moment that awaited him. When they arrived, Mrs. Thompson was sitting in the living room, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw Emma and Matthew enter. Emma gently guided Matthew forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mrs. Thompson, there's something you need to see," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Matthew, can you show Mrs. Thompson your toy car?" Matthew, a bit confused but trusting Emma, held out the little red toy car. Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the toy immediately. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch it, her voice breaking. "Where did you get this, Matthew?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for any sign of recognition. Matthew looked up at her, his eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of fear. "I've had it for as long as I can remember," he said softly. "It was the only thing I had when I was found by a couple camping. They took me to an orphanage." Mrs. Thompson's tears flowed freely as she listened to Matthew's words. She knelt down to his level, her voice choked with emotion. "Matthew, do you remember anything about your parents? About the accident?" Matthew shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, I don't remember much. Just flashes of a car and a lot of noise." Mrs. Thompson pulled him into a gentle embrace, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "Matthew, you are my son. We thought we lost you in that accident, but you're here. You're alive." The room was filled with a profound silence as the weight of the moment settled in. Emma watched with tears in her eyes, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment and joy. She had helped reunite a family torn apart by tragedy. Mrs. Thompson knew that explaining the years of separation to Matthew would be one of the most challenging conversations of her life. She wanted to be honest yet gentle, understanding that Matthew had already endured so much. One evening after dinner, Mrs. Thompson and Matthew sat together in the cozy living room. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow around them. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice filled with both sorrow and hope. "Matthew, there's something very important I need to tell you," she began, holding his hand gently. When you were just 5 years old, we were in a terrible car accident. It was your birthday, and we were on our way to celebrate. The car skidded off the road, and in the chaos, you were thrown from the car. Matthew listened intently, his eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of fear. Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice trembling slightly. Your father and I searched for you desperately. We were told that you didn't survive. We were heartbroken, but we never stopped thinking about you. We never stopped loving you. Tears welled up in Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she spoke. I can't imagine how hard it must have been for you, being alone and not knowing what happened. But I want you to know that we never gave up hope. We always believed that somehow you were out there. Matthew squeezed her hand, his own eyes filling with tears. I don't remember much, just flashes of the accident, but I always felt like something was missing, like I didn't belong anywhere. Mrs. Thompson hugged him tightly, her heart aching for the years they had lost. You belong here, with us. You're home now, and we'll make up for all the lost time. I promise you that. Matthew nodded, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a newfound sense of belonging. Thank you for finding me, he whispered. He felt a mix of relief, sadness, and a newfound sense of belonging. As he processed the information, a question lingered in his mind. Do I have any siblings? Matthew asked, his voice filled with curiosity and hope. Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened with a mixture of sorrow and love. She gently shook her head. No, Matthew. After we lost you, your father and I were so heartbroken that we couldn't bring ourselves to have more children. We spent our days grieving for you, and I focused on my business to cope with the pain. Matthew nodded, understanding the depth of their loss. He felt a pang of sadness for the years they had missed together, but also a sense of gratitude for being reunited. He hugged Mrs. Thompson tightly, feeling the warmth of her love and the promise of a new beginning. Mrs. Thompson smiled through her tears. It was Emma who brought us back together. She's been like a guardian angel for both of us. From that moment on, Matthew and Mrs. Thompson worked to rebuild their relationship, cherishing the time they had together. They created new memories, and with Emma's support, they formed a close-knit family, healing from the past and looking forward to a brighter future. Matthew, though initially overwhelmed, began to adjust to his new family. From that day forward, Mrs. Thompson and Matthew worked together to rebuild their relationship. They spent time sharing stories, looking at old family photos, and creating new memories. Mrs. Thompson made sure Matthew knew how much he was loved and cherished, and she supported him as he adjusted to his new life. Matthew thrived in his new environment, excelling in school and making friends. He found joy in the simple things, playing in the garden, helping Emma in the cafe, and spending time with his mother. The little red toy car, once a symbol of his lost past, now represented hope and new beginnings. It was a reminder of the journey that had brought him back to his family and the love that had never wavered, even through years of separation. Together, they looked forward to a future filled with love, resilience, and the promise of brighter days ahead. The moral of the story teaches us the dangers of unchecked ambition and greed, the importance of honesty and forgiveness, and the power of love and resilience in overcoming life's darkest challenges. It reminds us not to lose hope, and that true success comes from genuine intentions and the bonds we share with others. Thank you for watching Granny G Stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more of these stories.